Many years ago, I had a dream about opening a club which would only open its doors between the months of October and April. A warm, welcoming place with roaring log fires and cozy nooks where you could sit with your friends and chat about things that interest you. Well, I couldn't even begin to afford to open a club, so the dream died. But its passing is commemorated by this podcast, presenting, for the winter months, a series of cozy chats with friends old and new on topics of interest. Welcome to the October Club. We have a slight change from the advertised programme on the October Club tonight. I'll be discussing the unexplained with Richard Napper later in the series, but for now I'll be welcoming my old friend Chris Peterssen. Chris and I studied communications together at college, and he went on to become a successful local journalist in the southwest of England. I, on the other hand, went on to do this. Tonight we'll be discussing the topic of hoaxes, more specifically, hoaxes in the media, so be warned. In the area of hoaxes, nothing is ever quite what it seems. Hi Chris, welcome to the October Club.
Hey Paul, glad to be here, loving the decor.
Thanks, we try and make it homely and all that.
Well, it's certainly the place for a cosy chat.
It really is, and tonight we're going to be talking all about hoaxes.
Yeah, or are we?
Well, I hope so, because I'm not prepared for anything else.
Yeah, it's either that or the weather.
Actually, to be more specific, it's actually media hoaxes that we're discussing. We're not talking about conspiracy theories and all that nonsense.
No, we're not going down that rabbit hole. I think you and I have got pretty much the same opinion on conspiracy theories. Every time somebody starts talking about any sort of conspiracy theories, I just switch off. I don't understand how any reasonable, educated person can fall for all that garbage. I mean, the good thing about hoaxes, the kind of hoaxes that we'll be discussing tonight, is that they are ephemeral. They have a certain lifespan. People believe them to be true for a bit, and then they are revealed to be a hoax.
Oh, that's how it's supposed to be. The annoying thing about the internet is that it constantly is injecting new life into hoaxes that have been revealed to be hoaxes.
Well, yeah.
The Cunningly Fairies is a good example. I remember seeing on Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. Actually, I think it might have been Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers. The last two remaining sisters from the Cunningly Fairies pictures, who were quite old, in the 90s, that is.
To anyone who's not heard of the Cunningly Fairies, this is a series of photographs which some kids took in the 1920s, and they showed fairies at the bottom of the garden, all purported to, and Arthur Conan Doyle and people like that believed in them.
Yeah, and these kids, as old women, eventually admitted on the Arthur C. Clarke show that they had cut out cardboard fairies and stuck them on hat pins. And yet even if you go on the internet now, you can still find people who think they're real.
Well, yeah, it all ties in with the whole conspiracy theories thing, doesn't it? That kind of person believes the hoax is real and the confession is fake, even though those kids came out decades later and said, yeah, this was just us having a laugh. There are still people who want to believe it.
Yeah.
And you can't argue with these people. It's literally like banging your head against a brick wall. If they've chosen that they want to believe something, nothing, even the indisputable truth, will change their minds. It's mad. And, we'll be talking about Alternative 3 later. It's a TV hoax that admitted almost immediately that it was a bit of fun, and yet it's got this whole life of its own on the internet.
It's insanity.
It really is. It really is.
So, winding back a bit, what got you interested in hoaxes?
I think it was Ghostwatch. Ghostwatch was the big one for me, watching it in the 90s, and again, that was not intended to be a hoax. It was part of the Screen One series of plays, and it had the Screen One logo up front, and the announcer said it wasn't, it was a play. The Radio Times said it was a play, and because it was presented in that live format, the same as Spring Watch and all those natural history things, people convinced themselves it was for real.
And because they were presenters rather than actors.
Yeah, familiar faces in the 90s, like Michael Parkinson and Sarah Green. I mean, they're not going to be doing a play, are they? They're not actors. It's got to be real. People convinced themselves they were real, even though it never claimed to be.
Did you think it was real?
No, I was 22. I wasn't a kid. I was observant enough as well to actually notice that it was well advertised as a play. Still scared the shit out of me, though.
I remember I didn't see it on the day it was broadcast on Halloween, I think. I videotaped it and watched it the next day. I still lived at home at the time, but I was alone in the house, and I remember it was a terrible day, dark and pouring with rain, and I watched Ghostwatch absolutely glued to the screen, and even though even though I knew it was a fake, it still terrified me. That bit where the camera pans round and we see the ghost for a split second, and then it pans back and it's gone.
Fantastic, fantastic. So well made. But of course, there was that controversy afterwards where a kid with learning difficulties took his own life because he thought it was all real and that Pipes was coming after him or something. And the BBC got a hammering in the press. I mean, it wasn't really their fault because they didn't go out of their way to say, look, this is real. But you always have that element, and this will crop up a lot in this episode, where you find people tuning in halfway through, and instead of going, oh, this is weird, I'll look in the TV Times and see what it is, they just assume it's a real haunting or a real alien invasion, you know, like you do.
Of course, these days they'd have a trigger warning on the front and everything, you know.
Oh, God, yeah.
My favourite is where they say on the beginning of our programme, this programme contains strong language from the start. It's the from the start. Like, otherwise people might say, oh, it's got strong language in it, but I'll just watch the beginning.
Oh, no, I wasn't expecting strong language from the start.
It's crazy, but it shows how difficult it is to create something like Ghostwatch with modern sensibilities, or over sensibilities, I should say.
Yeah, it's a shame, though, because I really love that stuff.
Okay, so let's wind this one back to one of the first big media hoaxes, Orson Welles' broadcast of The War of the Worlds in 1936.
Again, not intended as a hoax. Wells and the Mercury Theatre had done all kinds of different plays, like Dracula and, you know, all kinds of things. And they were well known for performing at the time in that slot, as it were. But because they chose to present their adaptation of H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds, as if it was a radio broadcast of something that was actually happening in America, people got the wrong end of the stick, especially people who were tuning in late. And America was kind of paranoid at that time because war was brewing in Europe. And there was also this thing of how war was changing. The First World War started out with men on horseback in the way that war had been fought for generations. But by the end of the First World War, you had planes and tanks and Zeppelins. And the American people were afraid that an aggressor could turn up with new weapons that they couldn't fight against.
It's interesting. I don't know if you've read Stephen Baxter's authorized sequel to The War of the Worlds.
Nah.
Yeah, but he talks about how a Martian invasion in America would have come across in the late 19th century, and how America didn't really have an army at that time, at least not an organized one, covering all the states. After the Civil War, their concerns over conflict were mostly internal. They were pretty clear that Britain wouldn't try and invade again, and they didn't see why anyone else would want to threaten their borders. So World War One was a bit of a wake-up call for them.
Yeah, and this, of course, is between the wars, so they're prepared. But are they prepared enough? They've got the beginnings of the Reds under the bed thing. The Russian Revolution was just over 20 years earlier, and the capitalist United States was beginning to be wary that something like that could happen there. America was then, as it is now, run by powerful industrialists who didn't want to be stripped of what they had built or what their fathers had built and they'd inherited. It wasn't the full-on Red Peril scenario. That wouldn't come about for about a decade later.
George Powell's movie has that, though.
Oh yeah, the 1953 movie is heavily influenced by Orson Welles' radio version, but it is also influenced by the fear of communist conversion, as a lot of sci-fi movies of that time were. It's more explicit in things like Invaders from Mars, but there's definitely a flavour of it in the George Powell War of the Worlds.
I listened to the Wells broadcast in preparation for this, and, well, from a modern perspective, it's hard to see how it caused so much panic.
If indeed it did cause panic, the press then were even worse than they are now for stirring up trouble. This was the era of Hollywood Babylon and all that.
It does start with an announcement saying it's the Mercury Theatre and it's a play, but the thing was always about people tuning in late, as we'll find so often in these things, and hearing it presented as a live broadcast. But those people didn't obviously keep listening for very long, because after about 20 minutes, there's a commercial break, which I don't think you get on an important live news broadcast. And then the second half is more like a conventional play, which I doubt anyone would have taken for a real event.
Yeah, you do have to wonder how much was the press stirring things up. It's not even like radio was a new medium in 1938. People were listening to it and going, oh, magic words in my living room. I don't know. It's hard to fathom why people might have jumped to that conclusion that it was real.
There are still people who think it's real.
Add on, I'll get me tinfoil hat on. Yeah, if you go on the internet, there are genuinely people who think the War of the Worlds broadcast was a real event and that Orson Welles was either paid or pressured to hush it up, claim that it was a drama.
Which doesn't make any sense. It's clearly Orson Welles' voice in the thing.
But they think that version was recorded later and that the original version had real reporters who were killed by the Martians. Like I said earlier, you can't argue with these people. Once you go down that rabbit hole, nothing will convince them otherwise. Not evidence, not facts, nothing. The person involved can explicitly come out and say, this is not real. All of this is fake. And they won't listen. They'll just say, oh, well, of course you would say that, wouldn't they? That's exactly what you would say if it was real and you were trying to convince us otherwise.
I mean, some people are just nutters, but I've never understood people who believe in conspiracy theories for fun either.
No. Where is the fun in that? Where is it? It's fun to look at War of the Worlds and say, that was very well done. And the real fact that it fooled people demonstrated how well crafted it was. But to just blindly say, this is real, against all evidence, against all bloody logic, is just, I don't know. Sometimes I think people only do it because they get a kick out of winding up reasonably minded people, which is a bit sad, really.
Do you think War of the Worlds deserves to be counted as one of the all-time great hoaxes?
Insofar as it is a hoax, but as I think you said earlier, this and Ghostwatch, these things were not intended to be hoaxes. They're kind of hoaxes by proxy. The people who were hoaxed made them hoaxes. If I went to the cinema and watched, I don't know, Alien, and came away thinking it was a documentary because I was mentally ill or something, it doesn't make it a hoax, that just because it was, because it was not intended to hoax people.
Yeah.
War of the Worlds wasn't the first radio broadcast to do this, though, did you, Naga?
No, what was the first?
There was a BBC radio show in the 1920s called Broadcast from the Barricades, which was a satirical programme about riots in London over the price of theatre tickets, but it was presented as a live broadcast. Well, I mean, everything then was live, but it wasn't presented as a news thing, and a lot of people thought it was for real, caused quite a brouhaha.
I've never heard of that.
It was quite dark by all accounts. It ended with a politician being lynched from a lamppost. The weird thing was it was written by an Anglican priest who was an author and satirist. I can't remember his name. I should have written it down. Never mind. But yeah, that also got a lot of complaints because people tuned in late and didn't hear that it was supposed to be a satire.
People tuning in late has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, that and general stupidity.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone calling someone or something. I can see turning out of that black hole two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one and another one and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Oh, yeah, I can see the thing's body. Now it's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips. It seemed to quiver and pulsate, and the monster or whatever it is can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now, and the crowd falls back. They've seen plenty. The most extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. Well, I'll pull this microphone with me as I talk. I'll have to stop the description until I can take a new position. Hold on, will you please? I'll be right back in a minute.
You mentioned Alternative 3 before.
Yeah, amazing show.
Now, that's one that definitely did have a life of its own after its broadcast.
Very much so. And although at the time it was a legit hoax, it was only really meant to be one as far as the 50 minutes or so that the show ran. When the titles rolled, it had actors listed and mentioned April the 1st. So it was clearly admitting up front that the program you've just watched was a spoof, a bit of fun.
For anyone who's never heard of it, Alternative 3 was a 1977 episode of a genuine documentary show called Science Report, which did this one-off spoof for April Fool's Day, except it wasn't broadcast on April Fool's Day.
That was the big screw-up. If it had been broadcast on April the 1st, everyone would have just said, oh, this is a bit of fun. But it was broadcast in June because of a strike. What it was about was the idea that not just British, world scientists were being kidnapped to work on establishing a base on the moon and eventually Mars, because the Earth was dying and would eventually become uninhabitable. It's pretty grim stuff.
Yeah, and it was shot in this documentary style, using a lot of genuine information about the state of the world in 1977, such as the extremely hot summers in the past couple of years and earthquakes in various countries. These were real events, and they added sort of weight to the story.
Yeah, definitely.
I can just about remember the summer of 1976. I was 6 years old. It was so hot, and there was this plague of ladybirds. My parents lived in an upstairs flat in Filey, and I can you had to go up a metal fire escape to get in, and I can remember it just being coated with ladybirds just crunching under your feet as you walked up.
Yeah, and they mentioned global warming, which, yes, that was already a thing in the 70s. Shocking to think that 50 years later, nothing has been done about it, but they thought that it would result in a new ice age, which was an idea that had been kicking around since the Victorian times. That pollution from industry would trigger a new ice age. So people watching might have thought, yeah, I've read about that in the Daily Mirror, so it must be true. And that's how you really sell a hoax, give it a bit of truth, some factual information.
And false logic, which is how conspiracy theories work. If something sounds like it's logical, people are inclined to believe it, even if some of the contributing factors are just complete lies. There's a classic example quoted in Doctor Who. All elephants are pink. Nelly is an elephant, therefore Nelly is pink. As an isolated piece of logic, divorced from all of the other factors, it's watertight, but subject it to the slightest analysis and you realize that its first statement is an untruth. All elephants are not pink. So the whole thing is therefore bollocks.
It's interesting how issues raised in Alternative 3 have become more culturally significant in the years that followed it, because although global warming was known in 1977, and it might have been mentioned in Panorama or Doom Watch, but people wouldn't really think of it as a concern. But now, of course, it's a really big concern. Put something like Alternative 3 on now, and people would probably believe it completely. You've also got these scenes in it that look very sort of X-Files, a couple of decades before, the X-Files, where they interview a suspect in an underground car park. It just looks so X-Files. I'd be surprised if Chris Carter hadn't seen this before he created the X-Files, because, I mean, it does have that American following. There was a non-fiction book on it released in America. It's become part of the conspiracy theory landscape, but it's just an April Fool's gag in the UK, no different to, the spaghetti trees.
Of course, watching Alternative 3 today, you can't help spotting familiar faces and going, oh, look, that's Shane Rimmer from Thunderbirds.
Yeah. And the German scientist is Richard Marner, who played Colonel von Strom in Allo Allo. You're half expecting him to say, not only are the scientists missing, but so is the painting of the fallen Madonna with the big boobies.
It's an odd one, Alternative 3. You can see you can see why so many people fell for it. It's a lot of it is convincing, but there are so many things in it that make you think, okay, this is fake.
Oh, it's beautifully underplayed. Beautifully underplayed. If they'd done a spoof documentary saying, look, here's life on Mars, aliens were among us, here's a photo, I don't think anyone would have fallen for it. That's another secret to a successful hoax, keeping it just this side of abstract and not giving it too much detail. That's why the alien autopsy, which we shall discuss later, failed to convince.
You mentioned the spaghetti harvest before there. Maybe we should discuss some of these silly April Fools, of which British television has a long tradition.
Yeah, spaghetti harvest, that's one that always gets mentioned. That was in the 1960s, and it was supposed to show peasants harvesting strands of spaghetti, cooked spaghetti, mind you, from trees in southern Italy. It was so ridiculous, but a lot of people fell for it. I'm guessing spaghetti wasn't so much of a staple food then as it is now. Having said that, I'm sure that if you showed it today, it'd still get people believing it. People are just gullible. That's the top and bottom of it.
There were quite a few on That's Life as well. The Lurpaloof, this weird animal that springs immediately to mind. Even as a kid, I remember working out almost immediately that Lurpaloof was April Fool backwards.
For anyone under 50 or outside the UK, That's Life was a sort of consumer program that was always on a Sunday night. It kind of signified the end of the weekend for me as a kid. There was always weird shit on the program anyway. A dog who said sausages and rudely shaped vegetables. It wouldn't have surprised me if there was this bizarre ape thing called the Lurpaloof.
That's kind of why it's hard to fathom Ghostwatch fooling so many people. We were used to these primetime TV hoaxes in the UK, so it wouldn't have seemed out of place that we had an unscripted hoax story hosted by Michael Parkinson and Sarah Green.
I suppose it's because Ghostwatch was Halloween and not April Fool's Day. There's not such a tradition of Halloween hoaxes in the UK, or there wasn't at the time. But as we keep mentioning, it wasn't really a hoax. It was never intended to be. By all rights, it shouldn't have been included in a show about hoaxes, but I wanted to because, it's great. Can we just talk about Ghostwatch them all?
Yeah, why not? I mean, as I said earlier, I knew it wasn't real, and I wasn't even watching it live, but it still scared the shit out of me. And I think that, if nothing else, shows the power of the writing.
Yes, it's disappointing that the BBC backed down so totally on this because of that kid taking his own life. I mean, a guy died filming a stunt for Noel's house party, but it was back on the air a couple of weeks later because it was a popular show. Ghostwatch was a one-off play, so it was easy to sweep under the carpet. I'd be interested to know, other than the unfortunate tragedy how many complaints the BBC got for Ghostwatch. I'd like to bet it was less than they got for something like Threads, but they didn't turn their back on that. There were probably more people who thought that was real too. Oh no, the Duke Sheffield. It feels like Ghostwatch, like the BBC just lay down and submitted completely to Fleet Street.
It was originally supposed to be a serial, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It was supposed to be a 6-part serial without the as live elements, but the BBC were too tight to finance it, so it became this one-off thing in the film one slot. Ironically, if the BBC had put up the money to film the original version, they wouldn't have had these problems because it was the as live elements that triggered it all.
I have difficulty imagining it as a serial.
Yeah, it would have been a very different beast, I think. Maybe closer to something like the Stone Tape in tone. And I think it would have all been actors and stuff, having Parky and others in it. In a way, I think it would have been ahead of its time because they weren't really doing that sort of thing on TV in the early 90s. But by the mid-90s, when the X-Files was at its height, you literally couldn't move for these supernatural TV shows, on the box. I think it would have been similar to what we're now seeing in films like The Conjuring, and people would have been looking back at it and saying, oh, they're ripping off Ghostwatch.
I think it's very influential, though. A lot of writers today admit to being influenced by Ghostwatch.
Yeah, I mean, not bad for a show that has never been repeated on UK television, although you have been able to buy it on DVD for some time. It's got an incredible cult following, and not just with people like you and me who saw it at the time.
I'm not sure how it would go down with kids today. I mean, was part of its appeal the recognition factor? Was it down to us kids of the 70s and 80s saying, look, there's Michael Parkinson, there's Sarah Green and Mike Smith off Saturday Superstore.
There's Greg Jobs of Robot Wars.
I always forget he was on Robot Wars, him and Philippa Forrester.
Oh, don't. I had such a crush on Philippa Forrester.
What if Philippa Forrester had been nobbled by pipes on Ghostwatch?
I'd have been inconsolable, mate. Inconsolable.
Hello, your name is?
I don't want to give my name, but I think I have some information for you about the history of the house.
Well, what do you know about it?
Well, we've been into all that. We've got the deeds and searches going back to the year it was built, and the history of the site as far as the Doomsday Book and the ley lines.
Do you know Mr. and Mrs. Sellers?
Yes, they're on our list of tenants. They lived there in the 60s, I think.
Did you know they sublet a room?
No, I didn't know that.
Being illegal, it wouldn't be on the official records. The lodger was their nephew, Raymond Tunstall.
How do you know him? Why are you calling, sir?
I worked as a social worker when he came out of psychiatric hospital. He had several convictions for molestation, aggravated abuse, abduction of minors. He should never have been let anywhere near any community. He was a very disturbed man, in my opinion.
In what way?
From the time he moved to Foxhill Drive, he developed paranoid fantasies. He used to tell me there was a woman on the inside of his body, taking over his thoughts and actions, making him do things he didn't want to do. He started to wear dresses. The delusions got so bad, there was only one way to escape them. He took his own life. That's why I called. When I was sitting here watching the TV and...
Hello? Are you still there? If you are, please go on. Hello?
Do you think Ghostwatch would have worked on American TV?
Probably not. I think it's a particularly British format. At the time, you had Spring Watch and Badger Watch and all of these things, sort of natural history programs that relied on the idea of watching shy, timid, wild creatures with hidden cameras in a live broadcast. Ghostwatch was 100% in that vein, only instead of badges of blue tits, it was watching Ghost. Do I think that without the popularity of Springwatch, etc., Ghostwatch would have had the same impact? No, it was a cultural zeitgeist, no pun intended, of the 90s. It was a very 90s show.
Would it work today?
People would fall for it, but then people fall for anything today. People watch Towie and genuinely don't pick up on how scripted it all sounds. I think today's viewers are gullible in a way that viewers in the 90s weren't.
What's caused that? What do you think?
Buggered if I know. It's scary, though, because it's that same gullibility, that willingness to believe anything that allows people like Trump to rise to the top. I'm hoping that in this country we're still smart enough to see when someone like Nigel Farage is trying to use us. Politics employs a lot of the techniques of successful hoaxes, and it's a bit scary. Scarier than Ghostwatch or War of the Worlds ever were.
So the so-called alien autopsy footage, purporting to be from the Roswell UFO incident in 1947, surfaced slap bang in the middle of the X-Files mania. Coincidence?
Not remotely coincidence, and not remotely convincing, if I'm being honest. There was such a big buzz around it, with the press kind of jumping on the bandwagon saying, oh, is it real? But I remember seeing it for the first time and just laughing. You can tell not a lot of money was spent on it, nor a lot of attention to detail, because there are so many things that give it away as a fake.
Yeah, the thing that always leapt out at me was the telephone cables, which are the kind of spiral flex that was ubiquitous in the 70s and 80s, but they weren't even invented in 1948 when this was supposed to be set. The handsets on a 40s phone would be a straight cable, either coated in rubber or threaded cotton. I think that's demonstrative of the lack of basic research that went into this thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was shot in Camden in 1996, pretending to be New Mexico in 1947, and it just really doesn't convince. Nobody speaks because the accents would be a dead giveaway. The supposed aliens are just some sort of foam rubber, and they look really stiff and unrealistic. Supporters of the film, because there are people who thought this was kosher, said that they were stiff because of rigor mortis, but nothing dies and becomes stiff in a completely horizontal, erect pose like they were.
The film quality was kind of weird too.
Yeah, it kind of doesn't look at all like black and white film stock. It looks like what it was, 90s videotape with crappy overexposed film filter on it. Some people even argue that it could have been videotape because video cameras existed in 1947. Yes, they did, but that's totally not what the US Army would have used. They'd have had a handheld film camera that they could have got in close with and developed the film in private. They certainly wouldn't have had a bloody great TV camera rolling around on casters and requiring an OB unit in another room to process the pictures. They did a TV special hosted by Jonathan Frakes, with various people giving their opinions of the footage, but almost all of them came forward and said, hang on, they've cut out the bits where I said it looked fake. I don't think anybody was convinced.
I think Channel 4 showed it in this country, and I remember watching it and thinking, oh, come on. But it was just mega hyped.
Yeah, like you said, it was a slap bang in the middle of the whole X-Files fad. I want to believe, that was the buzzword. And you had a whole load of people the world over who wanted to believe that this was genuine, and they convinced themselves that it was genuine, but clearly it was a load of old bollocks. The most amazing thing is that the guy who made it took until 2006 to actually confess that it was a fraud. I mean, 30 years, he was really squeezing every last drop of credibility out of the thing. I don't think anybody was believing it by that point.
Did you ever see the film they made about it?
With Anton Deck, yeah, it was horrible. I think that's what forced the original bloke to admit that he'd faked it. Because once they'd made a bloody film about how they'd done the hoax, he couldn't really cling on to the idea that it was real, but he did insist that he'd seen the actual footage and he was just trying to recreate it.
That's what they all say, isn't it? It's like the Cunningly Fairies lady saying, yes, we faked these pictures, but there really were fairies at the bottom of the garden.
Exactly. My film might have been a fraud, but I'm not a fraud. Well, yeah, sorry, mate, you are. You made money out of it. You tried to fool people. You're a hoaxer.
These kind of hoaxes ease off a bit towards the turn of the century, though, because you have the Blair Witch Project bringing in an era of found footage films, which look as if they're real footage edited together, but they don't really try to convince you that it's actually genuine.
They did exist before the Blair Witch Project. I think there was at least one of those video nasty, flesh-eating zombie cannibal bastard type films that used the found footage thing. But Blair Witch definitely brought it right into the public eye and heralded a whole new slew of these types of film. But you're right, Blair Witch never tried to convince the audience that it was a genuine article. I mean, they couldn't really when you had Heather Donahue regularly appearing on chat shows to promote the film. Hang on, isn't she dead? But they claim that it was based on real legends and stuff, which a lot of people still believe to this day.
It sort of blurred the line between the intentional hoax and the movie that isn't really a hoax, but kind of looks like it could be.
Yeah, I mean, they could have easily chosen to make it a hoax. If someone had showed me the Blair Witch Project and the alien autopsy footage, and I'd never heard of either, and they said, which one do you think could be real? I'd definitely have chosen Blair Witch. It looks convincing. It's the greatest hoax that was never a hoax. But that's the reason why so few of these hoaxes are ever made as big screen movies, because a movie doesn't have the immediacy of a radio broadcast or a TV broadcast. You can't keep a secret for the 2 months or so that a film is running it in theatres. And studios want actors to be going out there and doing publicity and selling the product. The only way a film can be a hoax is if it's very low budget, very independent, and only running in little art house theatres. And even then, it's not going to have that impact. It's not going to have that punch of, oh my God, did you see that thing on TV last night?
It's odd that the millennium seems to be when hoaxes became less popular, because to me it's when the public really started to become more gullible. I mean, people really fell for the idea of the millennium bug, but even at the time I thought, oh, this is ridiculous, and I know nothing about computers.
It's the point at which it became difficult to differentiate between what was a hoax and what was quite simply a lie. I mean, your classic hoax is something like Alternative 3. It tries to get the audience to believe something for a limited time, in this case, the duration of the show. And at the end it says, nah, this is not real. We were having a bit of fun with you. Everybody laughs. Nobody gets hurt. But with something like the Millennium Bug, you have to wonder who is spreading the information, who's benefiting from it. The newspapers all had computing correspondents who could have looked at these suggestions and known that it was nonsense, but they still ran with it. They willfully caused panic among their readers. Why? Who was benefiting? Nobody knew why these things were happening, but it put an end to the idea of the jolly jape that puts the wool over people's eyes, for a while at least.
It's the beginning of the conspiracy theory.
As a broadly accepted thing, it is, yes. When stuff like the X-Files highlighted conspiracy theories, these things were seriously underground, and people who believed in them were laughed at. But less than a decade later, everybody knew somebody who'd previously thought to be an average Joe who was bang into this crap. It was like a disease of paranoia.
So in the last few years, we've seen a bit of a hoax renaissance, haven't we? Some are good, some are not so good.
Yeah, we've had a bit of a renaissance, but they can only really be done on terrestrial TV, which is on the decline. Streaming channels, by their very nature, can't really do hoaxes because they lack that immediacy. But terrestrial TV has had a few cracks at it in recent years. And like you say, some are more successful than others.
Channel 4 recently did a Greg Wallace show that tried to convince people that a company was producing or planning to produce genetically engineered meat that was created from human cells.
Yeah, I never watched that. It seemed a bit mean-spirited to me, as if the aim was to outrage the viewers. I mean, some of the hoaxes that we've covered have caused plenty of outrage, but they weren't designed specifically to provoke. Ghostwatch and Alternative 3 got in the newspapers, but they weren't made with the intention of getting into the newspapers. I think that demonstrates a kind of smugness that I don't really care for.
No, I didn't watch it either. And another thing that I didn't like, and I'm not sure if it was intended as a hoax, was the comedy series with Amanda Holden supposedly inviting her aged grandmother to live with her, but it was quite obvious from the first trailer that I saw that her grandmother was a guy in prosthetics. I think the intention was that they would eventually go, oh, haha, we fooled you. It was Lee Francis in a mask all along. But so few people were fooled that they kind of backed down and started going, yeah, no, that was our intention all along.
I'm kind of glad I didn't see that. It sounds awful.
It was every bit as awful as it sounds.
The real masters of the hoax in recent times, I think, are the guys on Inside Number 9. They've pulled off a couple of excellent hoaxes in that series. There was the one where there was supposed to be a live episode, but the podcast breaks down and they end up cutting to supposed off-air footage of the actors, and all this weird stuff happens to them.
Yeah, that was excellent. That was very Ghostwatch.
I'm sure they were influenced by Ghostwatch. Then there was that episode that was probably even better, where they advertised an On the Buses style episode with Robin Asquith, and everyone was really excited about it. But on the day that they announced that it had been cancelled, and they were showing a quiz show called 3x3 instead, which 3x3 equals 9. And it's a really believable, ordinary quiz show hosted by Lee Mack, but then weird stuff happens to the contestants.
And they hold it off for almost too long, to a point where people might start to switch off and not see the fantastic payoff.
It was magnificent. The last of the great TV hoaxes, in my opinion. And the genius of it is that Shearsmith and Pemberton are so savvy with their audience that they designed a show that the viewers would be champering at the bit to see, the On the Buses episode. A brilliant idea, but they never made it. It was just an irresistible red herring, and people still thought afterwards they might show it because there were publicity stills and stuff, but it didn't exist. They never made it.
Genius, pure genius. So do you think that media hoaxes have a future?
Probably not, because it's become almost too easy to hoax people. People will believe anything, and the tools to make them do so have become so freely available. And there are so many outlets for you and I to reach people on social media, on YouTube, even on podcasts like this. You could do a complete hoax podcast and people would be none the wiser.
Who's to say I already haven't?
But, I'm saying everyone has access to Photoshop and Pro Tools, and with the increasing availability of AI to the general public, it's a huge amount of what you see on the internet is fake. And predictably, a lot of people will believe in it. Every few days, something will drum into my feed that on Facebook that has a photo of a giant who lived in Patagonia in 1926, or an African tribe in the 19th century who had holes coming out their heads. And although you get a few people commenting, yeah, that's obviously AI, the vast majority of people going, wow, that's amazing. And it's quite scary, because when it's that easy to fool people, you can bet the farm that there are political forces out there who are using that same technology to get their own way.
And on that cheery note, I think we should wrap things up. Thank you, Chris, for appearing on the October Club tonight.
You're welcome, mate. And keep watching the stars.
I'm watching them. What's going to happen?
Just keep watching them.
I'm watching. I want to believe. That was Hoaxes. I'd like to thank Chris for joining me tonight, and I'll be back with another guest and another topic of interest in 4 weeks or so. You have been listening to the October Club with Paul Ferry and special guest star Chris Peterssen. The theme music was composed and performed by Peter Faulkner, and the show was produced and edited by Paul Ferry. This was a Mosaic production.